Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. During the previous arc, I discussed the murder of Diane Sindel, and I realised her death was reminiscent of another case featuring an abandoned car and a woman alone at night. In today's episode, I will take you to Hull in 1998 and a dark highway where a lone vehicle pulls onto a deserted petrol station forecourt. Extinguishing the engine, the beams of the headlights dispersed, leaving only the yellowish glow of the under canopy lights. Alighting from the vehicle, the single occupant proceeds to feed the fuel tank, paying little heed to the stillness of the scene around them. It had been a long, emotional night. Fighting exhaustion and on the verge of heartbreak, the solo female was distracted as she made her way towards the warm, welcoming light emitting from the kiosk. Shortly after the car pulled away from the petrol station, its red taillights disappearing from view, and just a few hours later, the Toyota Celica was abandoned on an isolated country lane, the keys in the ignition, and its female occupant nowhere to be seen. This is the story of Kirsty Carver. On the A164, roughly 5 miles north of the imposing Humber Bridge, sits the conveniently located Willoughby Park petrol station. In appearance, it is just a typical refuelling point, with 2 covered forecourts situated astride a small shop, where customers pay for fuel and buy refreshments before carrying on their journey, barely giving it a second thought. Yet in 1998, this particular, unassuming place became the last known location of 22-year-old Kirsty Carver, a bubbly and warm young woman whose personality shone through her bright chocolate eyes and big smile, framed by dark locks of brown hair, which formed in tight ringlets down to her shoulders. Beyond this attractive facade was an intelligent, career-driven 22-year-old who worked as a civilian computer operative at the Queen's Gardens police station in Hull. Kirsty had spent her early years living with her parents, Arthur and Vanessa, in Withensea, a seaside town 17 miles east of Hull, which enjoys and endures the changing moods of the North Sea. Day trippers bask on the sunlit sandy beaches in summer, while the residents endure the chill of winter storms. At the age of 16, Kirsty took part in a youth training scheme with Humberside Police, before going on to acquire a civilian role in the intelligence division at the police station. As a fresh-faced 18-year-old, she quickly established herself as a capable young lady, and became a well-liked member of the team. Around a year into her working for the force, Kirsty started a relationship with police constable Graham Jones, which saw her choosing to leave home and move in with him. Over the next couple of years, the pair had settled into a stable situation. Meanwhile, Kirsty continued in the intelligence division, but harboured ambitions of becoming a police officer herself. This goal was put in jeopardy when she was involved in a collision in a car park, resulting in a leg injury that potentially meant she was not physically able to carry out the duties of a serving officer. The injury didn't just have implications for her career, but also affected her personal life, as Kirsty descended into depression, prompting her to move back in with her parents and heralding the disintegration of her relationship with Graham. However, Kirsty did not let this deter her, as she continued to strive for her dream job and hoped to rebuild her relationship with Graham. Now in her early 20s, Kirsty started to regain her independence, having recently moved out of her parents' home and into a property with a friend in Hessel, 5 miles east of Hull city centre, and closer to her workplace. But her newfound freedom would be short-lived, as within days of moving in, Kirsty would disappear. The first signs that something untoward had occurred came in the early hours of Thursday the 5th of March 1998, when her distinctive turquoise Toyota Celica coupe was found on a narrow lane, occupied only by a couple of properties. Its presence drew particular attention as the door was unsecured and a set of keys remained in the ignition. Upon the vehicle being reported to police, it was quickly identified as Kirsty's, and efforts were made to track her down. An initial inspection of the car yielded no obvious signs of anything sinister having occurred, prompting the police to treat it as a potential missing persons case, although they could not rule out the prospect that she had voluntarily walked away. This seemed a possibility, particularly after her recent mental health issues, and police interviews with Kirsty's friends and family, which provided an insight into her state of mind at the time. Through these interviews, detectives were also able to build a picture of her last known movements. On the day prior to her vehicle being found, Kirsty had been food shopping, and later that evening, she visited the home of her ex-boyfriend Graham. The couple began to discuss the future of their relationship, during which Graham confessed he didn't see them getting back together, and admitted he may have met someone else. This heartbreaking revelation left Kirsty distraught, but she was unable to discuss it further as Graham had to leave to start his shift. Often it is the partner or spouse who becomes a key focus of a missing persons investigation. But Graham was quickly ruled out as a suspect, as he had gone to work that night as stated, and he was found to have not been the last person to see Kirsty. 2 more people would see the 22-year-old that night, the first being her friend Victoria Norris, whose home on Fountain Road was visited by Kirsty at around 7:30 that evening, and she would remain there for almost 3 hours. While at the property, Victoria consoled her friend and recalled that Kirsty stated she intended to meet Graham when he finished work at 4 a.m. the following morning to talk about their relationship. With her spirits lifted by Victoria, a determined Kirsty bid her goodbye at around 10:30. But it appears she did not head home. Instead, Kirsty drove her turquoise Toyota 3.5 miles away to Wold Road, where her friend Jeanette Farrand resided. Once inside the property, the pair sat down for a cup of tea and a chat, an interaction Janet would recite in court, stating, "Kirsty stayed for some time. She had come to see me because she lent me a black jacket and she wanted it, as she was due to go out to the waterfront with people who were finishing their shift. I invited her in and we sat and chatted. She told me she had been to see her former partner, and she told me that she was a little bit upset as he had indicated he may have met someone else, and he'd asked her how she would feel and how she would cope if he wasn't around all the time. Kirsty got very upset, and she cried when she told me this, but she was also angry with her former partner because he said it just as he was leaving for work, and she didn't have the opportunity to discuss this with him." Repeating what she had told Victoria regarding speaking to Graham after his shift had ended, Kirsty also disclosed her intention to meet up with some work colleagues and go clubbing. But the hours slipped by, and upon realizing it was now 1 a.m., she decided not to head to the waterfront. Janet offered to let Kirsty stay the night, but the beautiful brunette declined, which was a decision that would prove fatal, as pointed out by the prosecutor at the trial, Mr. Andrew Campbell, who stated, "Had she accepted that offer, no doubt she would be alive today, but it seemed a fateful decision she declined." Janet and Kirsty enjoyed another cup of tea, and 40 minutes later the host advised her friend she needed to get some sleep as she had work in the morning. And so she walked Kirsty to the door, bid her goodbye and watched as the young woman, wearing a black sports top, blue jeans and loafer-type shoes, walked to her car and drove away. This description of Kirsty was swiftly circulated to police forces and transport hubs across the country, with one of the assumptions being that she had chosen to disappear. Maybe she could not face the heartbreaking conversation she dreaded having with Graham, or perhaps she just needed time to herself. The main concern was that there had been no sightings of Kirsty on public transport, at airports or ferry terminals, and the question remained, why had she abandoned her car in that location? It was an isolated track, nearly 4 miles away from Janet's home, and just under a mile from the A164, which was the nearest main road. Had she simply walked away? And if so, where had she gone after leaving the vehicle? These concerns grew when it was noted that Kirsty did not seem to have anything with her to facilitate her voluntary disappearance. She had not been wearing a coat that night, despite it being a chilly March evening, and it seemed the 22-year-old only had £10 in cash on her person. If she planned to flee, surely she would require more money, yet her bank account remained untouched. Another aspect of her disappearance, which puzzled those who knew Kirsty, was the careless manner in which her vehicle, a car she took great pride in, had been abandoned, with the argument being that she would never have left it in such a state. A week after the last sighting of Kirsty with no new leads, a press conference was held during which her distraught parents, Arthur and Vanessa, made a heartfelt appeal to the public. All the while the search for Kirsty continued, radiating out from the point where her car was discovered, yet no new clues came to light. The days of uncertainty continued to drag on for her family and friends, desperate for answers and clinging to the hope that Kirsty was still alive, and perhaps she had just chosen to disappear. Yet another 2 weeks would pass without any new leads. Therefore, on April 1st, 1998, the police carried out a reconstruction of Kirsty's last known movements, with her car being driven along the route she was believed to have taken the night she disappeared. They reenacted her leaving Janet's home and the car arriving at the spot where it was found. The investigation was at a disadvantage, as despite Kirsty's car being a distinctive model, and probably one of the only vehicles on the road that night, she had been driving in the early hours of the morning in residential areas under the cover of darkness, meaning many potential witnesses were likely in their homes asleep. They also did not have the numerous CCTV cameras which would be available today. It was likely these factors which prevented the reconstruction having any impact on the investigation. It yielded no results. Police stepped up their search efforts with posters printed by the Hull Daily Mail, featuring Kirsty's photo being placed on lampposts and windows throughout the city. As news of the 22-year-old's disappearance spread, it prompted a large number of volunteers to come forward. The turnout was immense, with over 3,000 members of the public working alongside 300 soldiers, hundreds of police officers, specialist search teams and one psychic. They scoured farmland and gardens, woodlands and wasteland, while others trekked along the banks of the River Humber, which flowed roughly 3 miles away from where Kirsty's car had been found, with them following the course of the river until they reached the tip of Spurn Point, a peninsula of land which juts out into the mouth of the Humber and lies roughly 25 miles away from the lane where her car was parked. Yet these searches yielded no results. Her disappearance had brought the city together and was a topic of conversation amongst many in the community, with speculation, suspicions, and concern mounting regarding Kirsty's fate. Almost a month after her disappearance, missing posters populated nearly every street and shop window. Her absence was being discussed throughout the city. It had become a high-profile case that few could avoid, especially those who began to suspect that they may have vital information. One of these individuals contacted Humberside Police anonymously, with a caller advising that Kirsty's body was located on the Sperm Point Nature Reserve. And although this site had already been searched, the decision was made to deploy a team to conduct a second inspection, especially when their interest was piqued by the informant ringing them again, this time insisting that they didn't go through with the search. On the 6th of April, more people came forward with information, and an officer was dispatched to meet them at an address in the city. This led to one of them being taken back to the station, as his evidence was deemed to be of particular importance. All these witnesses had named one man, and to the surprise of officers, the named individual wandered into the police station to make inquiries about his friend, who had been brought in for questioning. He was promptly arrested and held in custody. Within hours of this development, the investigation picked up pace, as officers were deployed to a detached whitewashed bungalow on Booth Ferry Road in Hull. The only noteworthy aspect of this property is its conspicuous appearance amidst the rows of terraced houses which stand either side of it. But soon it would draw attention for another reason, as more officers descended, and the property was sealed off in order for forensic teams to carry out their work. It was the home of Maureen and Clifford Belcher, a regular couple residing on the outskirts of the city. Yet their lives were about to change forever, as the police invaded their home, cordoning it off as a potential crime scene, and news filtered out that their 23-year-old son Craig was being questioned regarding the disappearance of Kirsty Carver. Had it not been for 3 separate individuals naming Craig as a suspect, it is possible the police would not have honed in on him, as he seemingly had no connection to Kirsty. The pair lived 2 miles apart, and although they were similar in age, they did not share a social circle or frequent the same places, except for one. The rest of Belcher provided the detectives with a missing link in Kirsty's journey, dispelling the assumption that she had travelled from Jeanette's house directly to the isolated lane. It would emerge that the 22-year-old had made a stop for fuel at the Willoughby Park petrol station, located less than a mile from where the car was abandoned. The key detail for police was that Craig Belcher worked the night shift at the fuel station, and the 3 callers indicated that Kirsty had visited his workplace on the morning she disappeared, placing Belcher as the last person to see her. As the 23-year-old suspect was being held, the informant who had been brought in for questioning confirmed that they should conduct another search for Kirsty at Sperm Point. Once again, a team was dispatched. Their previous search had been hampered by the strong southerly wind which had whipped across the narrow strip of land. It had prevented the dogs from being able to pick up any scent, but on this occasion the officers had barely set foot amidst the scrubland when one of the animals alerted its handler to a piece of disturbed ground. A further examination determined it was a shallow grave that contained partially clothed remains, still adorned with jewellery, that indicated to the police they had found the body of Kirsty Carver, thus ending their month-long search. Carefully the remains were transported to the mortuary, where it was examined by Inspector Steve Love of Humberside Police, who stated, quote, "The visual identification by relatives was not possible due to the passage of time since her death, which appears to have been about the time of her disappearance." It was estimated that Kirsty's body had lain there for roughly 37 days, and the post-mortem revealed the manner in which she died. The pathologist noted that the body had multiple cuts and bruises. Kirsty had also suffered 2 fractures to the skull, one to her right cheekbone and another to her left arm. The latter detail suggested that Kirsty had held her arm up in order to defend herself from the blow. The pathologist deduced that these injuries were likely caused by a hammer, and the first blow to her head possibly rendered Kirsty unconscious, while the second and third were delivered swiftly and proved fatal. The news of their daughter's death devastated her parents, who had clung on to the hope that Kirsty would be found alive. Her mother's longing for this outcome had prompted her to buy an Easter bunny for her daughter the day before the body was found. Yet now they were faced with the reality that Kirsty wasn't coming home, which Vanessa Carver admitted to a local newspaper was hard to come to terms with, stating, "It's so hard to accept that Kirsty's not coming back. I could have accepted it more if there had been an accident or if Kirsty had taken her life, because then it would have been her choice, but not this. I need to know how long she was lying there, and I can't bear to think of her suffering, crying and being scared. When we were told a body had been found and it was Kirsty, then it was all so final, and all hope disappeared." With their hopes destroyed, Vanessa and Arthur began to seek answers regarding what happened to their daughter, and there was only one man who held all the answers. 23-year-old Craig Belcher was known as a quiet, unassuming and well-mannered individual, a facade which fooled many into believing he wasn't capable of murder. And initially, he would deny all knowledge of the crime. But when he was confronted with the evidence which implicated him, he opened up regarding what had occurred in the early hours of the 5th of March, 1998. He admitted that while working at the fuel station that morning, a black van had pulled up on the forecourt, and a local drug gang, whom Belcher acted as a runner for, got out, and they unloaded a woman from the rear of the vehicle, whom he stated was Kirsty. She, along with another man he knew as Andy, were forced into the storeroom of the shop, where they were assaulted. He then claimed that the pair were taken back to the van, injured but alive, and the vehicle drove away, but Belcher could not confirm where the gang would have gone. In this scenario, he alleged that his only involvement in the incident was to clean up the scene afterwards. However, this would not be the only version he provided the police, perhaps because his story failed to align with the evidence. The second statement saw him claim that Andy and Kirsty had arrived at the petrol station in her Toyota Celica. The pair entered the building and Kirsty was taken into the storeroom where Andy assaulted and killed the 22-year-old, before ordering Belcher, who worked as a drug runner for the man, to clean up the scene, including disposing of the body, with Belcher alleging that Kirsty had been killed because she had inadvertently become caught up in an incident between 2 rival gangs and had to be silenced. The only consistent detail in these 2 statements was Belcher accepting responsibility for covering up the crime and concealment of Kirsty's remains. This clean-up included mopping up the blood in the back room and disposing of any evidence, including Kirsty's car, which he dumped on a country lane before walking back to the petrol station. Officers were unconvinced, with one later referring to Belcher's statements as a, quote, extraordinary cock-and-bull story. Unable to convince the police, it was announced on the 11th of April 1998 that Craig Belcher had formally been charged with the murder of Kirsty Carver and would be remanded in custody until his trial, which commenced at Sheffield Crown Court in February 1999. At the trial, the prosecution would offer an opposing scenario to the one presented by Belcher, with prosecutor Andrew Campbell QC advising the jury that the motive for the attack could not be proven. But he suggested that perhaps, quote, she had been subjected to some sort of advance, which she had rebuffed. We cannot say, with him adding, but we do know she was left lying on the storeroom floor, bleeding heavily, with fatal head injuries. Providing the jury with some insight into the events leading up to the attack, Mr. Campbell detailed that Kirsty made the fatal decision to decline her friend Janet Ferran's offer to stay the night. Instead, Kirsty, quote, drove the 8 minutes to the Ricks Willoughby Park filling station for fuel. Records show she had been there before, and certainly she would be aware not only of its location, but that it would be open at that time of the morning. Only Craig Belcher has the answer to what happened next. The prosecutor, however, pointed out that it was standard practice for fuel stations to use a serving window at night for security reasons, meaning the shop remained locked. However, investigations had discovered that Belcher had often breached this protocol by letting customers into the store. As such, it was possible that he did the same for Kirsty that morning. Perhaps the 22-year-old had interacted with Belcher on previous visits, and his quiet, unassuming manner lulled her into a false sense of security. So, when he opened the door, she didn't suspect she was walking to her death. Andrew Campbell went on to propose that Kirsty was initially assaulted by the shop counter, yet tiles found in the storeroom stained with her blood suggest that the most brutal element of the attack occurred there, with Belcher forcing Kirsty into the room, grabbing a hammer from a toolbox and striking the young woman with it. Kirsty's life was ended quickly by the blows to her head, and as she lay on the floor, her assailant set about cleaning up the scene. He was disturbed in his endeavour by a worker from a company nearby, who had called at the station during their break, only to be informed that they couldn't fill up as the pumps were not working. On that occasion, the worker had noted a vehicle at one of the pumps, but when they drove past a short time later, the forecourt was empty and the shop was in darkness. The prosecution proposed that the absent vehicle, which they suggested was Kirsty's, had been driven from the scene and parked up on the country lane by Belcher, who then walked back to his place of employment to carry on covering up his crime before other staff members arrived. Evidence found in the Toyota Celica suggested that this part of Belcher's statement and the prosecution's scenario aligned, as his blood was found on the inside of the driver's door of Kirsty's car, not only placing him in the vehicle, but it spoke of the possibility he had injured himself during or after the attack. Traces of Kirsty's blood was also found on the steering wheel, implying the car had been driven after she had been attacked, while the absence of Belcher's fingerprints in the vehicle were explained away by the notion that he likely wore gloves. Upon his return to the petrol station, it was surmised that he secreted Kirsty's body into the boot of his Ford Escort and proceeded to continue cleaning up the area where the attack took place, in a desperate attempt to remove any traces. But in doing so, he also left clues, as reported by the cleaning team who arrived to start work, with them finding Belcher exiting the bathroom, appearing, quote, somewhat startled. Cleaners noticed the absence of certain items, including a mop, shovel, gloves, and a duster. They also recalled a wet patch, where it appeared someone had attempted to clean the floor. When asked about the stain by his manager, Belcher explained he had accidentally spilt some red fuel additive. However, forensic testings would confirm the stain was Kirsty's blood. While the cleaners noted that certain pieces of equipment were missing or had been moved, the store's maintenance man was bothered by the disappearance of his hammer from the toolbox he usually kept in the storeroom. Yet these little details were not enough to suggest that a serious incident had occurred just hours prior to them starting work. Other witnesses would be made aware of what occurred by Belcher himself, when he reached out to them for help. Mr. Darrell Ottaway was contacted by Belcher, who asked him to meet him in Beverley, a town roughly 8 miles north of Hull. Upon meeting up, the pair in Belcher's Ford Escort headed to the North Yorkshire moors and the 8,500-acre Dalby Forest. Having undertaken the hour-and-a-half drive, they learned that a fox hunt was underway, and Belcher insisted they didn't stop. It was during this journey that Belcher would reveal to Darrell the events of the previous night. He showed his friend a black purse which contained various cards and a couple of photos, one of a brown-haired woman who was identified as Kirsty, and the other was a picture of her father. Explaining the presence of the purse, Belcher informed Darrell that the woman and an Asian man had been killed at the petrol station by 2 men, and he had put the woman's naked and bound body in the boot of the car. Not wanting to be a part of whatever Belcher was caught up in, Darrell made his excuses and left, with him being one of the individuals who would later contact the police. Unable to get assistance from Darrell, Belcher would turn to another friend for help, this time offering £200 in exchange for aiding him. But again he was turned down. Therefore, Belcher drove to the nature reserve at Spurn Point, where the remains were found a month later. It was also alleged that Belcher had boasted to friends in a pub regarding the murder and the disposal of the body, a decision he later regretted as he took steps to convince them it was a joke. To further prevent those who had incriminating knowledge from turning on him, he tried to stir up trouble between the group, hoping that his friends wouldn't speak to each other, but his plan failed, and it was these individuals who contacted the police on the 6th of April, having learned of Belcher's attempts to manipulate them. Having been arrested, Belcher provided officers with inconsistent statements, with prosecutor Mr. Campbell denouncing the notion of a third party as a complete fabrication. The prosecutor went on to suggest that the more likely scenario was that Belcher had acted alone, luring Kirsty into the shop and ending her life in the storeroom, with him subsequently taking steps to conceal his crime. Although police were able to find evidence, including blood spatters on the walls and ceiling of the storeroom. Despite knowing what had occurred in the shop, Belcher continued his life as normal, even heading to work each day, where Kirsty's missing poster was prominently positioned in the window. The question was whether the jury of 8 men and 4 women felt the evidence was strong enough to support the claim that Belcher acted alone. And after 5 hours of deliberation, they came back with their decision that he was solely responsible for the death of Kirsty Carver. As the public gallery erupted with sounds of tears, relieved sighs, and joyful cheers, 24-year-old Belcher stared at his victim's family and shook his head. His lips moved, but his words were not audible. Sentencing Craig Belcher to a minimum term of 18 years. The judge, Justice Hooper, stated, "You are an intelligent and cunning man. You are a convincing liar, as well as a very dangerous one." With the judge's closing words, Belcher was led away to start his sentence at HMP Frankland. Meanwhile, outside the court, the case's lead investigator, Detective Chief Inspector Rick Monkman, addressed the press, stating, "Kirsty was a young woman who had everything to look forward to in life, but that life was brutally ended. But she made one mistake which cost her life. That mistake was to call at a petrol station, something that you or I do without even thinking." Personally, I think that this is the true tragedy of this case. Kirsty didn't make a mistake. She went to a petrol station, and she should have been able to do so without losing her life to the one person she probably feared the least in that moment, the man working in the kiosk. Craig Belcher was a man who many saw as mild-mannered and unthreatening. He had no prior convictions for any violent crimes, and hadn't committed any offences which were associated with those who commit sexually motivated killings. Yet after his conviction, new details about his character came to light. During the investigation, police had conducted an interview with a woman who worked as a manager of a restaurant located near the petrol station. She recalled that one night she had pulled onto the forecourt, and when she approached the kiosk window to pay, Belcher had asked her to come into the shop to assist him in fixing the microwave. However, this woman became uncomfortable, and she opted to quickly leave. Was this Belcher's first attempt? For officers, it seemed possible, especially when they tested the microwave and found it to be in working order. Was this how he lured Kirsty into the shop? Or had he recognised her fragile emotional state, and used comforting words and a friendly smile to lure her into a false sense of security, as he opened the shop door and invited her inside? Had he hoped that if he showed her some affection, Kirsty would reciprocate? It is possible, given the claims that Belcher was self-conscious regarding his appearance and unlucky in love. The latter was a situation which had led him to seek out affection from the women who patrolled Hull's red light district. He frequented the Fortin Street estate, where he was a regular customer, who didn't cause the women any issues. In 1996, Belcher took these casual interactions beyond the sex worker-client boundary, when he started regularly seeing a 20-year-old heroin addict whose sex work not only fueled her habit, but was helping support herself, her boyfriend, and a young child. Over a period of 19 months, Belcher would see the 20-year-old frequently, although the woman would inform detectives that intimacy rarely led to intercourse, with her alleging they only had sex 4 times, and she perceived their interactions as purely a business transaction. But he saw it as something else, with the woman stating, "He kept saying he loved me and that he had fancied me from our very first meeting. He also said he wanted me to go out with him." For almost 2 years, Belcher persisted on asking her to date him, and in February 1998 she conceded, with the pair going for drinks at the Country Park Inn located on the shores of the River Humber. After their date, Belcher drove her back into Hull, where she planned to work the streets. Yet on the way there he offered to pay her £50 if she spent the night with him. The 20-year-old rejected his proposal, but did agree to accompany him to a car park overlooking the river. It was here that Belcher expressed his feelings for her once more, but this time he presented her with letters, poems and songs that he had written for her. The 20-year-old told police, quote, "They were saying how much he loved me and that he didn't want me to leave him." She would also provide them with the additional details regarding who Belcher was, with her stating during a police interview that, quote, "Craig has a very low opinion of himself. He thinks he is fat and doesn't like his personality. He thinks his friends make fun of him. Craig began to say that he would love to ask me out on a date, but he was afraid I'd say no." Just 2 weeks before Kirsty was murdered, Belcher and the 20-year-old went on a second date to the market town of Beverley, where they spent time with one of his friends and drank in several pubs. His persistence didn't stop with him taking her on dates. Belcher seemed eager to help her get off the streets, offering her money and even a home, which he had recently started renting. The woman informed the police of his plans, stating, "He asked me to move into the house with him. I said, 'Don't ask me now, ask me in a few months, when I've got settled.' He asked me to have sex with him in the house, but I said no. He took me back home and gave me £20. That is the last time I saw Craig." Was it his persistent campaign to win her affections combined with her multiple rejections, which have proven to be a breaking point for Craig, who went on to take his frustration out on the next woman who turned him down. In an effort to get a further insight into the mind of the killer, Hull Daily Mail contacted Eric Rees, a graphologist, or what is more commonly known as a handwriting analyst. Over the years, Mr. Rees has offered his expertise to assess the handwriting of many individuals, ranging from Michael Jackson, Tony Blair, and Osama bin Laden. With regards to this case, Mr. Rees was provided with several letters written by Belcher and asked for his opinion on the individual who wrote them, and while some of his inferences would not be admissible in a court of law, he offered his insights into Belcher's personality, with the only information he had was that the author of the letters was a man recently charged with murder. Following his analysis, Mr. Rees concluded that, quote, "He is a very dangerous man because he has powerful feelings and urges he cannot properly express, and concealing information is normal to him. I have also identified a rebelliousness within him and a yearning for independence." We could infer that the latter was caused by his disappointment that at 24 years old he was still living with his parents. However, Mr. Rees continued with his analysis, stating, "He is very premeditated in his actions and statements, and depressive, with a mental maturity which is hampered by emotional immaturity, causing great frustration. There is also signs of perversity in his script, and I have concluded that Belcher would tend to do the opposite of what is expected of him. He resents authority, and will enjoy playing the helpless and hard-done-by person who needs assistance." The idea of him presenting himself as someone who is helpless may account for why so many people perceived him as harmless. Yet Mr. Rees also suggested that Belcher is a man whose emotional state requires him to maintain a set routine, with the graphologist deducing that should Belcher's routine be disturbed, quote, "It puts him out of kilter. He becomes something of a loose cannon." Had something put him out of kilter around the time of Kirsty's death? That is something we may never know, with her family left with many unanswered questions regarding what happened to their daughter. For 18 years, Kirsty's loved ones had the reassurance of knowing the man responsible for taking her life was behind bars. But as his minimum term came to an end in October 2019, it rendered him eligible for parole, and each year they now have to endure the fear that his application for release would be granted. His first parole hearing was conducted in 2021, and in April of that year the Secretary of State authorised his move to an open prison, which in most cases is the last step prior to release. This would be reassessed 2 years later in 2023, during another parole hearing. The board considered that Belcher was still at risk of reoffending, with them going on to release the following statement regarding their conclusions, quote, "At the time of his offending, these risk factors had included Mr. Belcher's way of life, his outlook, and his associates. He had looked for excitement but could be easily led, and he had not maintained steady relationships. There had been concerns about his emotional well-being and lack of empathy for other people. A deeper understanding of Mr. Belcher's triggers and risk areas had been hampered by his accounts of the index offence changing over time." They went on to report that during the time in prison, Belcher had demonstrated good behaviour, with the board stating that he had undertaken an accredited programme to address decision-making and better ways of thinking, and had completed a motivational training course. Mr. Belcher had had the benefit of educational and vocational training and had engaged with specialist teams in prison. They continued by addressing the decision to move him to an open prison in 2021, stating, "The Secretary of State has accepted an early parole board recommendation that Mr. Belcher should transfer to open conditions. He had done so in April 2021 and had recently successfully completed temporary release from prison. In this case, protective factors which would reduce the risk of reoffending were considered to be the support he could expect from some family members and evident developments in his coping and self-control. Despite these noted improvements, the board declined his application for complete release, with them concluding, "The panel examined the release plan provided by Mr. Belcher's probation officer and weighed its proposal against assessed risk. The plan included a requirement to reside in designated accommodation with additional support, as well as very strict limitations on Mr. Belcher's contacts, movements, and activities. The panel concluded this plan was robust but not yet ready to manage Mr. Belcher safely in the community. However, on considering the criteria for recommending placement in open conditions, the panel recommended that Mr. Belcher should remain in this location. As such, Belcher continued to reside within an open prison, but he would also be granted day release privileges, meaning he was permitted to leave the facility and be out amongst the general public as long as he adhered to certain restrictions. 2023 parole hearing decision is the last mention I can find regarding Craig Belcher, leading me to the supposition that he is possibly still living under the conditions set by the parole board 3 years ago. In cases such as this, I always try to consider what the victims' loved ones are enduring, not only because of their loss, but the pain and heartache ignited by every parole hearing, filling them with the fear and uncertainty that one day a killer may once again be free to walk the streets. Thank you for joining me for this instalment of It's Murder Up North. A new episode is coming soon.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.